The rain hammered against the windshield as Evelyn Carter drove through the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. It was 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in March 2025, and the city slept beneath a blanket of fog so thick it seemed to swallow the streetlights whole. She had been awake for 36 hours straight, fueled by black coffee and the kind of desperation that makes your hands shake even when you're sitting still. The radio crackled with static, then a voice broke through announcing another missing person report, the third one in 2 weeks. Evelyn turned it off. She didn't need the media's dramatized version of what was happening. She had her own files, her own timeline, her own obsession that had consumed the last decade of her life since her sister Anna vanished without a trace on a night just like this one. The address scrawled on the post-it note stuck to her dashboard led her to a neighborhood she recognized from her research, a cluster of modest homes built in the 1970s where families still left their porch lights on and neighbors knew each other's names. She pulled up to a small ranch-style house with peeling yellow paint and a garden overrun with weeds. A woman stood on the porch, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone screen. This was Margaret Hollis, mother of 17-year-old Daniel Hollis, who had disappeared 4 days ago after leaving a basketball game at his high school. Evelyn grabbed her notebook and stepped out into the rain, feeling the cold water soak through her jacket immediately. Margaret looked up as she approached, her eyes red and swollen from crying, and Evelyn saw in her the same expression she had seen in her own mother's face 10 years ago, that horrible mixture of hope and dread that comes from not knowing. "You're the investigator," Margaret said, her voice hoarse, "the one who works on the cases the police won't touch." Evelyn nodded, extending her hand. "I'm Evelyn Carter. I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me everything about the night Daniel disappeared, even details that might seem irrelevant." They went inside, and the house felt frozen in time. Daniel's basketball shoes still by the door, his backpack hanging on a hook, a half-eaten sandwich on the kitchen counter. Margaret made tea with shaking hands and began to speak, her words tumbling out in a desperate stream. Daniel had been at the game with friends. They had won. He was in good spirits. Around 9:30, he told his friends he was going to walk home because he wanted to clear his head. Think about college applications, normal teenage stuff. He never made it home. His phone went dead at 9:47, the last ping from a cell tower near Laurelhurst Park, an area known for its dense trees and winding paths where joggers went missing every few years. Evelyn listened carefully, taking notes in her precise handwriting, but her mind was already racing ahead, connecting dots that others would miss. This was the pattern. Always young people, always at night, always in areas with historical significance or natural landmarks that dated back generations. The police had classified Daniel as a runaway, citing the stress of senior year and college pressure, but Evelyn knew better. She had seen this before, too many times to count, in cities across America. There was something methodical about these disappearances, something that suggested planning and knowledge that went beyond random chance. "Has Daniel ever mentioned anything unusual?" Evelyn asked. "Strange people following him, odd symbols he might have seen, old stories about the neighborhood." Margaret frowned, thinking hard. "He did mention something weird a few weeks ago. He said he found some kind of carving on a tree in the park. Looked like Native American symbols or something. He took a picture of it, thought it was cool, wanted to research it for a school project about local history." Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. "Do you still have that picture?" Margaret pulled out her phone, scrolled through her messages, and showed Evelyn a photograph Daniel had sent her. The carving was crude, but deliberate, a series of interconnected circles and lines that formed a pattern Evelyn recognized immediately. She had seen variations of this symbol in 3 other cases, in 3 different states, always near the location where someone had vanished. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a screenshot, forwarding it to her own phone. This wasn't just another missing person case. This was connected to something larger, something that had been operating in the shadows for decades, using America's own forgotten history as a map for horror. "I'm going to find your son," Evelyn said, and she meant it with every fibre of her being, even though a voice in the back of her mind whispered that finding him might mean discovering truths that would break Margaret's heart forever. As she left the house and drove back into the rainy Portland night, Evelyn called the only person she trusted with information like this, Jason Miller, an ex-FBI agent who had been forced out of the bureau 3 years ago for exposing corruption within his own department. The phone rang 4 times before his gruff voice answered. "It's 4 in the morning, Carter. This better be good." She could hear the exhaustion in his voice, but also the alertness, the part of him that never really stopped being an investigator. "It's happening again, Jason. Another disappearance with the same markers, the same symbols. I need you to look at something." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Send me what you have. I'll meet you at the diner on Burnside in an hour." Evelyn hung up and felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. She wasn't alone in this anymore, but that also meant she was dragging someone else into the darkness with her, and she knew from experience that once you started down this path, there was no turning back until you reached whatever terrible truth waited at the end. The diner on Burnside Avenue was one of those 24-hour establishments that catered to insomniacs, night shift workers, and people running from something they couldn't name. Evelyn sat in a corner booth, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her, watching the door. Jason arrived exactly on time, looking older than his 42 years, his face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much and being able to do too little about it. He slid into the booth across from her without saying hello, his eyes already scanning the notes and photographs she had spread across the table. He wore a faded denim jacket over a grey shirt, his dark hair showing streaks of silver at the temples, and there was a hardness to his expression that hadn't been there when Evelyn first met him 5 years ago, back when he still believed the system could be fixed from within. "Daniel Hollis," Jason said, tapping the teenager's school photo. 17, good student, athlete, no history of running away or depression. "The Portland PD is treating this as low priority because there's no evidence of foul play." Evelyn leaned forward. "Look at the location where his phone died. Laurelhurst Park. Now look at this." She pulled out a map of the United States she had marked up with red dots, each one representing an unsolved disappearance over the past 15 years that matched the same pattern. Every single one of these cases involves someone vanishing near a historical site, usually connected to Native American territory, early colonial settlements, or locations where significant but forgotten events took place. And in at least 7 of these cases, witnesses reported seeing symbols carved into trees or rocks nearby, symbols that don't match any known language but appear to be some kind of coded message. Jason studied the map in silence, his jaw tightening. He had learned to trust Evelyn's instincts even when her theories sounded impossible, because she had been right too many times before. "You think there's an organized network behind this?" he said quietly. "Not a serial killer, not random abductions, but something coordinated across state lines, maybe even across decades." Evelyn nodded. "I think someone is using America's hidden history as a blueprint. Every location has a story the mainstream narrative ignores. Indigenous burial grounds that were paved over, sites of massacres that never made it into textbooks, places where people have been disappeared by governments and corporations for over a century. Whoever is doing this knows those stories, and they're using them deliberately, like they're trying to send a message or complete some kind of pattern we don't understand yet." Jason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Evelyn recognized as his tell when he was processing something disturbing. "When I was still with the Bureau, I came across a case file that was buried so deep it barely existed. A task force in the 1990s investigated a series of disappearances that matched this profile, young people vanishing near culturally significant sites, always without a trace. The investigation was shut down abruptly, all the agents reassigned, and the files were classified under national security protocols. I never understood why until I tried to access them again 3 years ago and found myself pulled into an office and told in no uncertain terms to drop it. He looked at Evelyn with an expression that was equal parts anger and fear. They threatened my pension, my reputation, everything. That's when I knew this was bigger than a criminal case. This was something people in power wanted to stay buried. A waitress refilled their coffee cups, oblivious to the gravity of their conversation, and Evelyn waited until she walked away before speaking again. I need to go to Laurelhurst Park, see the carving for myself, try to understand what we're dealing with. Will you come with me? Jason hesitated, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might refuse, might choose the safety of distance over the danger of involvement. But then he nodded slowly. Yeah, I'll come. But Carter, we need to be smart about this. If there really is an organization behind these disappearances, and if they have the kind of reach to shut down federal investigations, then we're walking into something that could get us killed or worse, disappeared, like everyone else we're trying to find. They left the diner as dawn began to break over Portland, the sky turning from black to grey, the rain finally easing into a fine mist. Laurelhurst Park was a sprawling green space in the heart of the city, beloved by locals for its walking paths, duck pond, and towering oak trees that had stood for over 100 years. At this early hour, it was deserted, except for a few joggers and a homeless man sleeping on a bench. Evelyn led Jason to the eastern edge of the park, near a section of woods that backed up against a residential neighborhood. According to Daniel's phone records, this was the last place his signal had been detected. The trees here grew thick and close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the early morning light, and the ground was soft with decades of fallen leaves and moss. It took them 20 minutes of searching before Jason called out, "Over here!" Evelyn pushed through the undergrowth and found him standing in front of an ancient oak tree, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. Carved into the bark, about chest height, was the symbol from Daniel's photograph, but seeing it in person was different, more disturbing. The lines were deep, cut with precision, and the wood inside the carving had darkened with age, suggesting this symbol had been here for years, maybe decades. Evelyn reached out and traced the pattern with her fingers, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The symbol consisted of 3 concentric circles connected by radiating lines, with smaller marks at specific points that resembled a calendar or map. "This isn't random vandalism," Jason said, pulling out his phone to photograph it from multiple angles. "Someone with knowledge of indigenous symbology created this, but it's been modified, corrupted somehow. Look at these connecting lines. They don't match any traditional patterns I've seen." Evelyn pulled out her own phone and overlaid the photo with images of symbols from other disappearance sites. The patterns were similar but not identical, like variations on a theme, and suddenly she understood. "They're coordinates," she breathed. "Not geographic coordinates, but temporal and cultural ones. Each symbol marks a specific moment in American history that's been erased or rewritten, and the disappearances are happening at the modern locations that correspond to those historical erasures." Jason stared at her. "You're saying someone is making people vanish as a way of forcing us to confront the parts of American history we've tried to forget?" Evelyn shook her head. "I don't think it's about confrontation or teaching. I think it's about continuation. Whatever happened in those historical moments, whatever violence or injustice took place, it's still happening now, just in a different form. The disappearances aren't random acts, they're rituals, reenactments, a way of keeping old patterns alive." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and Evelyn could see Jason struggling to accept what she was suggesting, that the country's buried sins had somehow taken on a life of their own, manifesting as a horror that consumed the innocent to feed something ancient and unresolved. For the next 3 days, Evelyn and Jason worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession, sleeping in shifts, living on takeout food, and turning Evelyn's small apartment into a command center covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. The walls were papered with printouts of missing persons reports, historical documents about indigenous removals, records of lynchings and massacres that had been scrubbed from official histories. Evelyn had developed a system of color-coded strings, connecting different cases, creating a web that revealed patterns invisible to anyone looking at just one disappearance at a time. Jason brought his FBI training to bear, using databases he technically no longer had access to, but had kept backdoor passwords for, pulling up classified files and cross-referencing them with Evelyn's research. What emerged was a picture so disturbing that even Jason, who had seen the worst of human nature during his years with the Bureau, felt his hands shake as he compiled the evidence. The disappearances stretched back further than either of them had realized. Not just 15 years, but potentially a century or more, with clusters of vanishings occurring in predictable cycles, always near sites of historical trauma. In the 1880s, young people from indigenous communities near reservation borders disappeared without trace. In the 1920s, children of freed slaves in the South vanished during the Great Migration. In the 50s, teenagers from immigrant families in industrial cities went missing during periods of economic upheaval. The pattern repeated across generations, always targeting the vulnerable, always at moments when the country was trying to move forward without acknowledging what it was leaving behind. "Look at this," Evelyn said, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. She pulled up a digitized newspaper article from 1932, a tiny item buried on page 7 of the Chicago Tribune. 5 young men disappeared from the Pullman neighborhood over a period of 2 months. All of them were children of union organizers, all vanished after violent clashes between workers and company security. The police investigation concluded they had run away to avoid gang violence, but listen to this detail. Every family reported that their son had mentioned seeing strange symbols carved into buildings near the rail yards in the weeks before they disappeared. Jason leaned over her shoulder, reading the faded text. Pullman. That whole neighborhood was built by the railroad company, a company town where workers lived under total corporate control. When the union strikes happened, they brought in private armies to break them, killed dozens of people, and then buried the story. Evelyn pulled up another file. Now look at this. 3 years ago, 2 teenagers disappeared from that same neighborhood, which is now gentrified, turned into expensive condos and artisan coffee shops. Both victims were the grandchildren of families that had been displaced when the area was redeveloped in the 90s. And both of them had posted on social media about finding old symbols carved into the foundation stones of the new buildings. The connections were undeniable, frightening in their consistency. Whoever was orchestrating these disappearances had access to detailed historical knowledge and was operating with a long-term vision that transcended individual lifetimes. This wasn't the work of a lone serial killer or even a single criminal organization. This was something that had roots deep in American soil, something that fed on the country's refusal to fully reckon with its own past. Jason stood up and paced the small apartment, his mind racing. We need to think about motive. If this is about historical continuity, about keeping old patterns alive, then who benefits? Who has the resources and the motivation to maintain this kind of operation across generations? Evelyn had been asking herself the same question for years, and she had a theory that terrified her precisely because it made too much sense. What if there's no single organization, no shadowy cabal pulling strings? What if the disappearances are emerging from the cultural unconscious itself, from communities that have learned to perpetuate violence because violence was done to them? From institutions that protect themselves by sacrificing individuals, from a system that requires certain people to vanish in order to maintain the illusion of progress. Jason stopped pacing and looked at her. You're suggesting the perpetrator is America itself, the accumulated weight of unresolved trauma manifesting as an ongoing pattern of harm. Evelyn nodded slowly. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a very real, very human way. Think about it. How many police departments have been caught covering up crimes to protect their reputation? How many corporations have silenced whistleblowers to maintain profits? How many families have disappeared inconvenient members to preserve their image? The mechanisms for making people vanish have always been there, embedded in the structures of power. What we're seeing might just be those mechanisms operating at a larger scale, coordinated by people who benefit from keeping certain histories buried. The realization hung between them like a poisonous fog, because if Evelyn was right, then they weren't hunting a criminal they could arrest or an organization they could dismantle. They were confronting something woven into the fabric of American society, something that would fight back with every resource at its disposal to avoid exposure. Jason sat down heavily, rubbing his face with both hands. If that's true, then we're not just risking our lives by investigating this. We're risking becoming part of the pattern ourselves, two more inconvenient people asking uncomfortable questions about things powerful interests want to stay hidden. Evelyn met his eyes. I know, but I have to keep going, Jason. My sister is out there somewhere, or at least the truth about what happened to her is, and if I stop now, then her disappearance means nothing, accomplishes nothing, except adding to the silence. Jason was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity that said more than words could. Okay, then we keep digging. But we need to be smarter about it. No more direct confrontations, no more obvious questions that will alert whoever is watching. We go dark, use encrypted communications, assume we're being monitored, and we find someone on the inside, someone with access to the real files, the ones that never see daylight. Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude and something else, a feeling she had almost forgotten, the sense that she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. I might know someone, she said quietly. A historian at the University of Oregon, Dr. Sarah Chen, specializes in indigenous history and government document classification. She's published papers about how federal agencies have systematically destroyed records of land theft and cultural genocide. If anyone would understand what we're looking at and have the expertise to help us decode these symbols, it's her. They agreed to approach Dr. Chen the next day. But that night, as Evelyn lay awake in her bed listening to the rain start up again outside her window, she felt the familiar weight of obsession settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She thought about Daniel Hollis, about her sister Anna, about all the faces staring out from the missing persons reports covering her walls, and she wondered if finding the truth would bring any of them peace, or if it would just reveal that they had been sacrificed to something so vast and systemic that justice was impossible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jason. Get some sleep. We'll need our wits tomorrow. She smiled faintly at the concern behind his words, but sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when somewhere out there, Daniel Hollis might still be alive, might still be waiting for someone to care enough to find him. Doctor? Sarah Chen's office at the University of Oregon was exactly what Evelyn expected. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with academic texts, indigenous artifacts displayed with careful respect, and walls covered with maps showing the original territories of Native American nations before colonization. Sarah herself was a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a tight bun, sharp eyes behind rimless glasses, and the kind of focused intensity that came from dedicating your life to uncovering uncomfortable truths. She listened to Evelyn and Jason's presentation without interruption for 45 minutes, studying the photographs of symbols, the timeline of disappearances, the connections to historical sites, and when they finished, she was silent for so long that Evelyn feared she would dismiss them as conspiracy theorists. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice measured, but carrying an undercurrent of deep anger. What you've discovered is both more and less extraordinary than you realize. The symbols you found are variations of indigenous boundary markers, specifically from Pacific Northwest tribes, but they've been corrupted, combined with elements from other cultural traditions in ways that suggest deliberate syncretism. Someone with extensive knowledge of multiple indigenous belief systems created these, but they're using that knowledge for purposes that would horrify the original cultures. As for the pattern of disappearances, you're looking at something I've spent my career documenting from the other side, the systematic erasure of inconvenient populations whenever American expansion required it. She pulled a thick file from her desk drawer, setting it between them with a heavy thud. In 1855, the U.S. government forced the signing of treaties that removed indigenous populations from the Willamette Valley to reservations. Thousands of people were marched away from their ancestral lands, and hundreds died or disappeared during that process, vanished into unmarked graves or taken by diseases deliberately spread through contaminated blankets. The official records show clean numbers, orderly relocations, but the truth is a horror of forced disappearances that was never properly documented or acknowledged. Now look at where Daniel Hollis vanished. No, she pulled out a detailed historical map and laid it over a modern map of Portland. Laurelhurst Park sits on land that was a major indigenous village site before removal, a place where families were torn apart and people were made to vanish from their own homeland. The fact that a teenager disappeared from that exact location, marked with symbols that pervert indigenous imagery, is not coincidence. It's continuation. Jason leaned forward, his voice tight. You're saying there are people actively perpetuating these patterns, using the original crimes as a template for modern disappearances? Sarah nodded grimly. Not just people, institutions. I've documented cases where development companies have made indigenous activists disappear when they opposed construction on sacred sites. I've found evidence of police departments coordinating with private security firms to remove homeless encampments by arresting people on false charges and losing them in the system, modern disappearances that echo historical Indian boarding school kidnappings. And I've tracked family dynasties, the descendants of the original colonizers and industrialists, who maintain their wealth and power by ensuring certain questions never get asked and certain people never get heard. She fixed Evelyn with an intense stare. Your sister, Anna Carter, she was researching environmental contamination in indigenous communities before she disappeared, wasn't she? Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She had never told anyone except Jason about Anna's work, had barely spoken about her sister at all, outside of private moments. How did you know that? Sarah's expression softened with genuine sympathy. Because 5 years ago, a young activist came to me with similar research, documenting how mining companies were poisoning reservation water supplies and covering it up with falsified EPA reports. That activist disappeared 3 weeks after our meeting, and when I tried to follow up, I found myself being watched, my office searched, my car tampered with. I backed off because I was afraid, and I've regretted that cowardice ever since. When you contacted me yesterday, I pulled Anna's file from my private archives. She had been following the same patterns you're uncovering now, the connection between historical erasures and modern disappearances, and she got too close to something that someone powerful wanted to keep hidden. The room seemed to tilt around Evelyn, and she gripped the edge of Sarah's desk to steady herself. For 10 years, she had been searching for her sister, driven by grief and rage and the need to understand, but she had always assumed Anna was a random victim. Wrong place, wrong time. Now Sarah was telling her that Anna had been targeted specifically because of her work, that her disappearance was an act of deliberate silencing, and that truth hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Jason put a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, and she forced herself to breathe, to think, to push past the emotion and focus on what this revelation meant. If Anna was targeted, then you have her research, Evelyn said, her voice shaking but determined. You have files, evidence, Something that would tell us who wanted her silenced. Sarah hesitated, then made a decision that visibly cost her, pulling a key from around her neck and unlocking a drawer in her desk that Evelyn hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a false panel. Inside was a USB drive and a stack of photocopied documents. Anna gave me copies of everything she had, told me to keep them safe in case something happened to her. I promised I would, but I was too afraid to do anything with them after she vanished. I told myself it was to protect her family, to protect you, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. She pushed the materials across the desk. Now, I'm giving them to you, because you've done what I couldn't. You've kept searching, kept fighting, and you deserve to know what your sister died for if she died, which we still don't know for certain. Evelyn took the USB drive with trembling hands, feeling the weight of 10 years of questions concentrated in this small piece of plastic. Jason was already flipping through the documents, his FBI training kicking in as he scanned for relevant information, and Evelyn saw his expression darken with each page. "These are internal communications from Cascadia Mining Corporation," he said slowly. Emails discussing how to handle indigenous activists who were blocking a proposed lithium mine on treaty-protected land. And look at this. They reference a consultant group called Historical Solutions, LLC, specialists in managing community relations and resolving obstacles to development. The language is coded, but it's clear they're talking about making people disappear, relocating them involuntarily, discrediting them, or worse. Sarah pulled up more files on her computer. Historical Solutions is a shell company, but I've traced its board members to some of the oldest and most powerful families in the Pacific Northwest, descendants of timber barons and railroad magnates who built their fortunes on stolen indigenous land. They operate through a network of subsidiaries, legal firms, private security companies, even charitable foundations that fund historical preservation projects, ironically enough. On the surface, they look like legitimate businesses, but underneath, they're a mechanism for perpetuating the same patterns of erasure and violence that founded this country, just with modern tools and legal cover. Evelyn felt pieces clicking into place, the pattern finally revealing its full, terrible shape. They're not just making people disappear to protect specific projects or profits. They're maintaining a system, a way of being, that requires certain voices to be silenced, certain histories to stay buried, certain people to remain powerless. And they do it by co-opting the very symbols and locations of historical trauma, turning the sites of original violence into modern crime scenes, completing a circle that keeps the past alive in the present. She looked at Jason and Sarah, seeing in their faces the same mix of horror and determination she felt burning in her own chest. We have to expose this, all of it. The connections between Historical Solutions and the disappearances, the pattern of erasure spanning generations, everything Anna discovered and probably died for. Jason shook his head slowly. "Evelyn, if we go public with this, we're painting targets on our backs. These are people with the resources to make federal investigations disappear, to corrupt entire police departments, to silence anyone who threatens their interests. We need protection. We need allies with power, and we need irrefutable evidence that's distributed so widely they can't suppress it all." Sarah stood up, and for the first time since they had entered her office, Evelyn saw something other than academic restraint in her expression. She saw fury, righteous and fierce. "I have contacts in indigenous rights organizations, journalists who have been trying to break stories like this for years, lawyers who specialize in holding corporations accountable for crimes against native communities. If you're willing to take this public, I'll help you build a coalition that can't be ignored or silenced. But you need to understand what you're asking. This will consume your life, put you in constant danger, and the chances of actually getting justice are slim at best." Evelyn thought about Daniel Hollis, still missing, still waiting for someone to care enough to find him. She thought about her sister Anna, who had tried to fight this same battle and had been erased for her courage. She thought about all the faces on her wall, all the people who had vanished into the dark spaces of American history, and she knew with absolute certainty what she had to do, even if it destroyed her. "I've already given my life to this," she said quietly. "The only question is whether I give it in silence or in struggle." Jason sighed, but there was a faint smile on his tired face. "Then I guess we're doing this. Historical Solutions has been operating in the dark for too long. Time to drag them into the light and make them face what they've done." They worked through the night in Sarah's office, building a strategy, identifying allies, preparing evidence packages that would go to multiple media outlets simultaneously to prevent suppression. As dawn broke over Eugene, Evelyn stepped outside for air and found herself looking at the Willamette River, flowing dark and swift beneath the morning mist. She thought about all the rivers in America that carried similar stories. The Mississippi, where enslaved people had drowned trying to escape, the Colorado dammed and diverted to erase indigenous water rights, the Hudson polluted by industries that profited from immigrant labor. The country was built on disappearances, on the systematic erasure of anyone who stood in the way of progress as defined by power, and that pattern would continue until enough people refused to look away. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging or join your sister." Evelyn stared at the message, feeling fear spike through her, but also something else, confirmation that they were close, that Historical Solutions knew they were being hunted and was scared enough to make threats. She deleted the text and walked back inside, where Jason and Sarah were finalizing their plan. "We go public in 72 hours, Jason was saying. "Simultaneous release to the New York Times, The Guardian, ProPublica, and indigenous media outlets. We include Anna's research, the Historical Solutions documents, the timeline of disappearances, everything. Once it's out there, it becomes too big to suppress." Evelyn joined them at the table, and as she looked at the evidence spread before them, she allowed herself a moment of hope, fragile and fierce, that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time the truth would be too loud to silence. But even as she thought it, she knew from her decade of searching that the truth was rarely enough, that exposure didn't guarantee justice, and that the patterns woven into American history were deep enough and strong enough to survive even the brightest light. The question wasn't whether they would win, it was whether they would fight, and as Evelyn met Jason's eyes across the table and saw her own determination reflected back, she knew the answer. They would fight, because the alternative was to let Historical Solutions, and everything it represented, continue unopposed, and that was a betrayal neither of them could live with. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, and Portland woke to another day, unaware that in a small office at the university, 3 people were preparing to shatter illusions the city had maintained for over a century. Evelyn thought about Daniel Hollis one more time and whispered a promise into the silence. "I'm coming for you. We're all coming for you." And in that moment, she believed it completely, even knowing that the closer they got to the truth, the more likely it became that they too would vanish into the same dark patterns they were trying to expose. Another set of names on a wall, another mystery for someone else to solve in a future that might never learn the lessons of the past.